It was the first week of October 1984, and the hills above Grover's Mill, Tennessee, had turned the particular gold and amber that people who grew up there carried with them their whole lives. The color you see when you close your eyes and think of home. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves, and on Saturday mornings the sound of the high school band practicing carried all the way down from the ridge to the feed store on the main road, where men in John Deere caps stopped to listen for a moment before going back to what they were doing. Grover's Mill was a town of about 3,200 people, tucked into a fold of the Cumberland foothills, and it had the quality that only small towns in that part of Tennessee had in those years. The quality of a place that believed in itself, that had been the same size and shape for 3 generations, and saw no reason to be anything different. There was a hardware store, a diner called Lorene's with a hand-lettered specials board that hadn't changed the font in 20 years, a public library that sat on the corner of Clement Street and River Road, with a green awning that needed replacing, and a step out front that was worn smooth in the center from 40 years of feet coming and going. That library was where Ellen Voss spent her days. She was 29 years old in the fall of 1984, slight, dark-haired, with a way of listening that made people feel as though what they were saying actually mattered. She had grown up in Grover's Mill, gone 2 counties over to college, and come back the year before to take the librarian position when old Mr. Haney retired. She drove a dark green Datsun that she'd bought used from a dealer in Knoxville and named, privately, Harold, because she thought it had the face of a herald. She had a daughter, Macy, who was 4 years old and attended the Methodist Church daycare 3 mornings a week. And on the mornings Macy wasn't in daycare, Ellen brought her to the library and set her up at the low table near the picture books with a box of crayons. And the regulars who came in on those mornings knew to say good morning to Macy first, before they said anything else. Because Ellen had mentioned once, laughing, that Macy considered it a personal slight when adults skipped her. Ellen had a habit of tucking a pencil behind her ear that she then forgot about, so that by late afternoon she often had 2 or 3 pencils in her hair and didn't know it. She was working on a reading program for the elementary school, Saturday story hours, a prize system for summer reading, and she had pinned a hand-drawn poster in the library window advertising the first session. That poster was still in the window when the library opened Monday morning, and Ellen did not come in. She had last been seen on the evening of Saturday, October 6, 1984, at approximately 7:30 p.m. Her neighbor on Birchwood Lane, a retired schoolteacher named Vera Alcott, had heard Ellen's car pull into the driveway next door and the engine cut off. Through the kitchen window, Vera could see the light on in Ellen's front room. At 9:15 p.m., Vera let her dog out into the yard and noticed that Ellen's porch light was off, unusual for that early, because Ellen always left it on until she went to bed. Vera thought nothing more of it. At 7:20 the following morning, Macy's father, from whom Ellen had been separated for 8 months, arrived to pick up Macy for the day as arranged. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. He tried the door. It was unlocked. Macy was inside. She was 4 years old, and she was unharmed, and she had been alone in the house since sometime the night before. Ellen was not there. She was found 2 days later, on October 8th, in a dry creek bed off a logging road 4 miles outside of town. She was 29 years old. She was Macy's mother. She was gone. The Grover's Mill Police Department called in the Moore County Sheriff's Office within hours of Ellen's disappearance being reported. Lead investigator assigned to the case was Detective Sergeant Roy Pittman, a 15-year veteran who had worked across 3 counties and who drove a county-issue Chevrolet Caprice with a broken rear defroster that he had been waiting on the department to replace since February. Pittman was the kind of detective who did not rush and did not panic, and whose patience outlasted most of what he was investigating. He had two observations within the first 48 hours that he wrote in the case file in capital letters and underlined. The first was that Ellen's Datsun, Harold, was found parked behind the Grover's Mill Community Center, 6 blocks from her house. The doors were locked. The keys were in her purse, which was on the kitchen counter at Birchwood Lane. Someone had driven that car to the community center and left it there. Someone who had not needed the keys to start it. Pittman underlined that twice. The second observation was that Macy's overnight bag, which Ellen always packed for weekend visits with her father, had not been packed. Ellen had known he was coming Sunday morning. She had not packed the bag. Someone had interrupted her Saturday evening before she expected to be interrupted. Pittman developed two persons of interest in the first 3 weeks. The first was Ellen's estranged husband, a man named Gerald Voss, who worked at the auto body shop on the edge of town. Their separation had not been entirely amicable, and 2 of Ellen's friends told Pittman independently that Gerald had made remarks in the months prior that concerned them. Nothing specific, nothing they could point to as a threat, just an undertone of bitterness that had not diminished the way bitterness is supposed to diminish when time passes. Pittman interviewed Gerald twice. He had a partial alibi for the evening of the 6th. He had been at a friend's house until approximately 8 p.m., which the friend confirmed, and the gap between 8 p.m. and the likely time of death left insufficient window to eliminate him entirely. Pittman kept him in the file. The second person of interest came from a different direction. A man who ran the fuel and feed supply operation on the county road outside of town. A well-regarded business owner who had known Ellen's family for years, whose children had grown up in Grover's Mill, and who had been seen, according to 2 separate witnesses, driving slowly past Birchwood Lane on the afternoon of Saturday the 6th. One of those witnesses was a woman who lived across the street. The other was the man's own 8-year-old son, who had been in the truck with him that afternoon, and who, when Pittman came to the house to speak with the family in the course of his wider canvass, mentioned it in the uncomplicated way that children mention things they don't yet understand the weight of. The boy's name was Danny Hollowell. Pittman wrote the name in the file. He noted the drive past. He interviewed the father, whose name was Curtis Hollowell, and who was measured and cooperative, and who explained that he had driven that route because it was a shortcut to the grain distributor on the other side of town. Pittman noted the explanation. He noted that the shortcut was, in fact, a plausible shortcut. He did not have enough to go further. He wrote a question mark next to Curtis Hollowell's name and moved on to the next page. Gerald Voss was formally cleared in November of 1984, when a second witness came forward, who had seen him at a gas station 12 miles away at a time that made the timeline impossible. That cleared him and collapsed the most viable suspect. Pittman went back to his files and stared at the question mark next to Curtis Hollowell's name for a long time. He did not have physical evidence connecting Hollowell to Ellen. He did not have witnesses beyond the drive past, which proved nothing. What he had was a boy who had been in the truck and a father who had an explanation. He wrote in the file, Hollowell, no evidence to advance, continue to monitor. Then the case, without new leads and without pressure from above, began to do what cases do when they run out of road. It slowed, and then it stopped, and then it settled into the particular quiet of something that is not closed but is no longer moving. Ellen's mother, a woman named Frances Birch, who had moved to Grover's Mill when Ellen took the library job so she could be close to Macy, sat in a chair in her daughter's house for the 6 weeks after the funeral, and then got up and did what she had to do. She raised Macy. She took her to school on the first day of kindergarten, and every day after that. She drove the dark green Datsun, Harold, because it ran, and because getting rid of it felt like something she could not afford to do. She put Ellen's reading program poster in a frame and hung it in the kitchen. She called the sheriff's office twice a year, every year, and Detective Pittman answered her calls until 1999, when he retired. And after that she called whoever answered and explained who she was and what she was calling about, and most of them were kind, and none of them had anything new. Macy grew up knowing her mother's face from photographs and from Frances's stories, and from the way Frances described her. The pencils in the hair, Harold, the reading program, the way she listened. With the specificity of a person who was terrified of forgetting anything, and had decided that the best defense against forgetting was to keep saying it out loud. By 1994, 10 years had passed. Danny Hollowell was 18 years old. He had grown up in the same town where it happened, 4 streets from Birchwood Lane, in the house where his father still lived, and ran the feed supply business, and attended First Baptist, and coached Little League through Danny's entire childhood, and went to church picnics and the 4th of July parade on the town square. Danny had been 8 years old in the truck that afternoon. He was old enough, by his early teens, to understand what his presence in that truck meant, and what it might mean, and why his father had never wanted to talk about that Saturday again after the sheriff's deputies came to the door. He was old enough, by the time he was 17, to understand the shape of what he was carrying. He was not old enough yet to know what to do with it. By 2002, 18 years after Ellen's death, Danny Hollowell had married, moved to Murfreesboro for work, and had a daughter of his own. The daughter's name was Ellie. He had not chosen the name consciously, or so he told himself for a while. Frances Birch had by that point moved to a smaller house on the east side of Grover's Mill, and was in her late 60s, and had never, not once, stopped asking the question. Macy was 22 and had finished community college and was working at a hospital in Cookeville. She had never lived anywhere near Grover's Mill again, but she called Frances every Sunday. By 2008, 24 years after October 6th, the green awning on the library had finally been replaced. A new director had ordered it the spring before, and the worn stone step at the entrance had been patched over with fresh cement that still looked too new against the old building. The library had a computer terminal now, 2 of them, and a summer reading program that a newer librarian had designed, and someone who did not know the history might look at that hand-lettered sign in the window advertising the program and not feel anything at all. Frances Birch felt something every time she walked past. By 2015, 31 years had passed. Curtis Hollowell was 67 years old. He still lived in Grover's Mill. He had retired from the feed supply business in 2011 and spent his days doing the things retired men in small Tennessee towns did: the garden, the grandchildren, the Wednesday morning coffee at Lorene's with the other men his age. His name appeared in the Grover's Mill Courier twice that year, once in a photograph from the Heritage Day Parade, and once in a brief notice recognizing longtime members of the First Baptist congregation. Danny Hollowell, 40 miles away in Murfreesboro, watched his daughter Ellie grow and thought about things he had never been able to stop thinking about. And the weight was not lighter than it had been. It was heavier. It had been getting heavier for 31 years. Every case on this channel represents weeks of work, going through records, cross-referencing timelines, trying to understand what was lost and what it cost. If this is work that matters to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It means more than you know. Now, let's get back to Ellen. The case had been cold for 37 years, when a man walked into the Murfreesboro field office of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation on a Thursday morning in January of 2021 and asked to speak with an investigator. He was 44 years old. He had driven from his house to the field office and sat in the parking lot for 22 minutes before he went inside. He had a folder with him. In the folder were three things: a handwritten account of what he had witnessed as an 8-year-old boy in the cab of his father's truck on the afternoon of Saturday, October 6, 1984. A dated journal entry from 1997, written when he was 21 years old, in which he had tried for the first time to put into words what he knew and could not bring himself to say. And a photograph, a Polaroid, faded at the edges, that he had found in a box of his father's things when the feed supply business had been sold and the old storeroom cleared in 2012. He had kept the photograph for 9 years before he walked through that door. The Polaroid showed Ellen Voss's dark green Datsun parked outside a location Danny recognized. It had not been taken from a public angle. It had been taken by someone standing close enough to the car that the license plate was legible. The date embossed along the bottom edge of the Polaroid was October 6, 1984. The TB investigator who received Danny Hollowell that Thursday morning was Special Agent Carla Deming, who had 20 years with the Bureau and who had worked 4 cold cases in the previous 3 years. She sat across from Danny for 2 hours and 40 minutes and let him say everything he needed to say before she asked her first question. She said afterward that she had never had a witness who had been carrying something for as long as Danny had, and that in the room that morning, when he finished, the silence was not emptiness. It was something releasing. Records show that a search warrant for Curtis Hollowell's property in Grover's Mill was obtained within 5 days of Danny's statement. Physical evidence recovered during the search, combined with a second item found in a storage unit registered to Curtis in a neighboring county, provided the corroborating foundation that, together with Danny's account and the Polaroid, prosecutors determined was sufficient to proceed. Curtis Hollowell was arrested on the morning of February 17, 2021, at his home in Grover's Mill. He was 68 years old. He was in the kitchen when the officers arrived. He looked at his son, who was standing outside by the car at the end of the driveway, and he did not speak. He looked for a long time. Then he turned back to the officers and let them put the handcuffs on. He said nothing else that morning. Court documents confirm that his expression, in the words of the arresting officer, was not surprise. It was something more like recognition, the look of a man who had known for 37 years that this door existed and had finally heard someone knock. When the news spread through Grover's Mill that afternoon, the response was not what Danny had feared it would be. He had expected anger, or disbelief, or the kind of community loyalty that closes ranks against the person who disrupts the story a town has been telling itself. Instead, what the people of Grover's Mill felt, and what they said at Lorene's and outside the hardware store and on the sidewalk in front of the library, was something closer to grief than outrage. Not grief for Curtis Hollowell, who had sat in their pews and eaten their food and let them believe he was one of them, while Francis Birch called the sheriff twice a year for 37 years. But grief for what they had not seen, grief for the years, grief for Macy. Francis Birch, who was 83 years old and living in the same small house on the east side of town, received the phone call from the county sheriff's office on the afternoon of the 17th. Her granddaughter Macy, who was 41 years old and drove to Grover's Mill that same evening, found Frances sitting in the kitchen with her hands folded on the table and Ellen's reading program poster on the wall behind her, and Frances said, simply, she would have wanted to know his name. That was all she said for a while. Just that. In December of 2022, following a jury trial that lasted 9 days, Curtis Hollowell was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He did not testify in his own defense. He did not address the court at sentencing. He was led from the courtroom without speaking. Danny Hollowell was not in the courtroom for the verdict. He had been present for parts of the trial, but on the day the verdict was read, he was at home in Murfreesboro, sitting in his daughter Ellie's room while she was at school. And when Carla Deming called him with the news, he stayed on the phone until she had finished, and then he sat in the quiet for a while before he called his wife. He had done the thing he had been unable to do for 37 years. He did not know yet what to feel about that, and Carla Deming, who understood these things, had not expected him to know. Ellen Voss was 29 years old. She drove a used Datsun she had named Harold. She forgot pencils in her hair. She was building a reading program for the children of a town that had needed one, and she had pinned the poster in the window before anyone knew to take it down. She had a 4-year-old daughter who loved her and who grew up without her, and who called her grandmother every Sunday for the next 37 years, because that was the thread that kept Ellen present in the world. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. The courage of a person who knows something unbearable and carries it for decades, and then, finally, walks into a room and sets it down. Danny Hollowell was 8 years old in the fall of 1984. He was 44 when he opened that door in Murfreesboro. What he gave up to do it, and what he gave back in doing it, belongs to the complicated territory where justice and love and grief all run together and cannot be fully separated. He did not undo what happened on October 6th. No one could. But he made sure that the person responsible for it did not outlive accountability. And in a case that had been cold for 37 years, that is the closest thing to justice that was still available. Sometimes that has to be enough. Sometimes it is. What do you think it cost Danny Hollowell to carry that knowledge from the age of 8 to the age of 44, and what do you think finally made him walk through that door? Does a son's testimony against his own father represent justice, or something more complicated than justice? And what does it mean that Francis Birch called the sheriff's office twice a year for 37 years, and that the answer came not from forensics or technology, but from a boy who was in the wrong truck on the wrong afternoon and spent a lifetime deciding what to do about it? Justice came for Ellen Voss after 37 years. Her daughter kept her alive through every one of them. If you believe that kind of love deserves a witness, subscribe so you never miss the next case. More are waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here.